You're listening to the Paranormal Path podcast. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Paranormal Path podcast. We're going to stay with the theme of ghosts and hauntings one more time this episode, and I'll be right back to discuss the 9 haunted places in Canada you definitely shouldn't visit alone. Welcome back. Our first thing to share comes to us from theloop.ca. 9 haunted places in Canada you definitely shouldn't visit alone. The Ottawa Jail Hostel in Ontario. This old stone building served as Ottawa's jail for over a century and closed back in 1972. A year later, it opened as a hostel for budget travelers visiting the city. Not much time at all to clear out the ghosts. The jail was the site of 3 executions, all by hanging, including the legendary execution of Patrick J. Whelan for the assassination of one of Canada's Fathers of Confederation, Thomas D'Arcy McGee. As many staff and guests of the hostel will tell you, Whelan's ghost still haunts the building, even appearing at the foot of guests' bed. You can still stay in the jail, even in an original 3x9 foot, one-person cell, with a few modern creature comforts added, of course. Frank Slide, Alberta. In 1903, in the wee hours of the morning, 82 million tons of rock broke free from the mountainside above Frank, Alberta, burying part of the town, its rail line, and a local coal mine. Between 70 and 90 residents were killed, most of whom remain buried in the rubble to this day. Ever since then, residents have reported seeing spooky mists and lights on the mountain where the landslide happened. Peggy's Cove, Nova Scotia. This major tourist hotspot makes no secret of its treacherous location. The lighthouse atop smooth, weather-worn rocks is picture perfect, but the whole place can be dangerous and downright fatal when rough weather hits and the rocks get slippery. One local legend tells the story of an original resident, Margaret, nicknamed Peggy, who settled here after surviving a shipwreck nearby. Her children didn't make it, and she would regularly walk the rocks at night, grieving their loss. One night, her new husband went out with her and danced on the rocks to cheer her up, but he slipped and died, and Margaret later took her own life. Visitors to Peggy's Cove have reportedly seen the ghost of a woman in a blue dress standing at the edge of the rocks, about to jump. Blue Ghost Tunnel, Ontario. This abandoned 655-foot-long railway tunnel near St. Catharines, Ontario, was in use for only 39 years, but was the scene of many accidents, including a teenager killed by a boulder and a train collision just outside of the tunnel. Not to mention 107 men killed during the tunnel's construction alone. Today, there have been reports of all sorts of paranormal activity inside the tunnel, like weird lights, the sensation of being watched, touched, or pushed, plus the sounds of footsteps, children crying, voices, and whistling. Craig Derrick Castle, British Columbia. This lavish castle was built in Victoria, BC in 1890 as a private home for a local coal baron who died before construction was complete. It passed through many hands since then and is now a tourist attraction open for tours. But rumor has it some old residents still call the castle home. There have been reports of a ghostly woman in white who stands alone in the castle ballroom, the sounds of children crying, and even a piano that plays itself. The St. Louis Ghost Train, Saskatchewan. Along an old abandoned railway in St. Louis, Saskatchewan, there have been many reports of a train light that travels up and down the line, changing in color and intensity as it moves. Some say it's a ghost train. Others say it's the light from the lantern of a ghostly brakeman who was beheaded by a train in the area way back when. Banff Springs Hotel, Alberta. The majestic 19th century Fairmont Banff Springs was one of the original railway hotels built by CP Railway to attract travelers westward. While the hotel denies it's haunted, there's a long-standing story about a bride who died while falling down one of the hotel's grand stone staircases in 1932. To this day, there are reports that her ghost, still in her wedding dress, has been seen dancing alone in the Cascade Ballroom. Gastown, British Columbia. Gastown was the heart of the original city of Vancouver and is steeped in lore, legend, and quite a few ghost stories. Rumors abound about the ghosts at the old Hotel Europe and a ghost train conductor who now lives at the old spaghetti factory on Water Street. But perhaps the most haunted building is the stately waterfront station, originally built as the city's train station in 1914. Many late-night security guards and cleaning staff have reported sightings of ghosts and the sounds of Depression-era music sounding through the hallways. The Royal York Hotel in Ontario. One of CP Railway's old stock hotels once stood tall on Toronto's skyline. Today, it's still one of Toronto's most luxurious and grandest hotels. But like many of these old buildings, it's full of ghost stories. There are tales of the sounds of children running up and down the halls, only to turn silent upon further investigation. Some guests on upper floors, in rooms under the once lively Crystal Ballroom, which was permanently closed because of the fire code infractions, report hearing voices and music coming from the vacant space. We'll be right back with part 2 to discuss the unbelievable story of the Greenbrier Ghost. Welcome back, everyone. Up next from dustyoldthing.com and credited to Chris Foster is this unbelievable story of the Greenbrier Ghost who helped solve her own murder. On a January afternoon in 1897, a neighbor boy in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, made a startling discovery: the dead body of Elva Zona Heister. Elva's husband, Erasmus, or Edward, Shue, had sent the boy to see if she needed him to pick up anything from the market before he came home from work. Shue was working on location as a blacksmith at the time and had only been married to Hester for 3 months. After coming across Hester's lifeless body, the panicked boy ran to tell his mother what he had found. His mother promptly alerted the local doctor, Dr. Knapp. By the time Dr. Knapp arrived to examine the body, Shue had already returned home and had washed and prepared it for burial, dressing her in a high-necked dress while placing a veil over her head. As Dr. Knapp began examining the body, his attempts to inspect the head and neck area were hindered by Shue. He was cradling her head while crying, and responded violently any time the doctor came near. After examining the rest of the body and finding nothing substantial, Dr. Knapp determined that the cause of death was everlasting faint, which he later changed to complications from pregnancy. Dr. Knapp had been treating Hester for a few weeks prior to what he described as female trouble, so he assumed the death was related. Soon thereafter, Hester's body was taken to her childhood home of Little Sewell Mountain for her funeral. During the ceremony, people began to notice that Shue was acting rather strange. He was obsessing with Hester's head and neck, wrapping her in a scarf that didn't match her dress. He insisted it was her favorite scarf, and placing excess pillows around her head, claiming he wanted her to rest comfortably. Most of the guests chalked it up to grief, except one, Elva's mother, Mary Jane Heister. Heister had never liked Shue, and was convinced that he had something to do with her daughter's passing, despite a lack of evidence proving so. She prayed every evening for several weeks, hoping to find some sort of answer. Finally, a month after her daughter's funeral, Hester's prayers were answered. She claimed that Elva's ghost had appeared in her dreams 4 nights in a row, telling her that Shu had murdered her by choking her and breaking her neck. According to the ghost, Shu was upset when he returned home from work and thought that Elva hadn't cooked any meat for dinner. After the 4th dream, Hester went to speak with the local prosecutor, John Alfred Preston. She told Preston about her dreams and what the ghost had said, and while Preston was skeptical, he decided to follow up with Dr. Knapp. After learning from the doctor that Shu had become violent and refused to let him examine Elva's neck and head, Preston decided to reopen the case. An autopsy showed that the 1st and 2nd vertebrae in Hester's neck were broken, and that her windpipe was crushed. There was also finger marks on her neck, indicating that she had been strangled. Eventually, the case went to trial, with Mary Jane Hester serving as the prosecution's star witness. Preston was careful to avoid bringing up the ghost story since it might be considered hearsay by the defense. Shu's lawyer, on the other hand, had decided to question Hester about her dreams during cross-examination, hoping to prove that she was an unreliable witness. The plan backfired, however, as the jury seemed to believe Hester's story. It didn't help that Shu took the stand in his own defense and did quite a poor job. According to a report from the Greenbrier Independent, Shu's testimony made an unfavorable impression on the spectators. The jury deliberated for just over an hour before returning a guilty verdict. Shu was sentenced to life in prison and eventually died in 1900 due to complications from measles and pneumonia. Though Hester's ghostly testimony wasn't the sole evidence used in the case, Shu, he had a history of domestic violence, including the mysterious death of a previous wife. It did mark the first and only time the testimony of a ghost was used in a court case. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You know, someday we're all going to take a ride in that big black hearse. So I couldn't think of a more fitting way to finish off this episode than with some tales that come to us from ScarySideOfEarth.com. Terrifying accounts shared by morticians. This one's entitled The Occupants. One building is said to be haunted by the ghost of a man who had a heart attack while working there for the Walker Funeral Home. We called the ghost Gino for the man's first name. While stationed there at night, we heard many footsteps above us where his office once was. One time, we had to leave the building altogether because we heard what sounded like a basketball dribbling upstairs that got stronger and louder until the point that paint from the ceiling began falling on us. One female that worked there woke me up screaming one night, saying she felt someone touch her and then saw an older fat guy run for the stairs. This was enough to get me to leave again, and this is only one of the buildings. The adjacent building was the place of many more hauntings that I heard of. My own experience is only one that kept recurring. Most nights, as we were returning to quarters from a run, my partner and I would scope the parking lot for vagrants or people that shouldn't be there before we opened the bay doors. While looking on more than one occasion, we would see a light on in the adjacent building on the top floor. There should have been no lights on. Figuring someone had gotten inside, we would watch the building for more lights. No other lights ever came on, but on every occasion, a young woman in a dress would come to the window and stare at us. One night after seeing the figure, we got brave and called some law enforcement friends from the area to help us search the building. We went to the room that had the light on, expecting to find a vagrant camped out there. The only thing we found was a room that had untouched dust on the floor and no light bulbs in the sockets. We got the willies and split. We never went back into that building at night. The Man in the Blue Suit. My first encounter with the spirit world inside of a funeral home took place back in 1999. I was a lowly funeral assistant back then, whose duties involved greeting families, floor work at visitations and funerals, answering the phone, and cleaning. It was my job to come in early, clean the funeral home up, turn all the lights on, and prepare for the funeral service that would begin later that morning. After reading a portion of the daily newspaper and drinking a few more cups of coffee, nature called. I didn't want to miss any phone calls inquiring about the morning's funeral service, or, God forbid, miss a family who walked into the funeral home. So I used the small employee restroom in the back of the funeral home and left the door open to listen. As I momentarily stood there taking care of business, I heard footsteps walking up the hall towards me. I turned my head and saw a man in a suit walk by the doorway, turning his head to look at me as he walked by. I was humiliated. Here I was standing there using the restroom with the door open, and a family walked in. I shouted, "I'm sorry, sir, I'll be with you in 1 second." I couldn't have possibly been more embarrassed. I quickly washed my hands and went out to meet him. I walked to the front of the funeral home and found nobody there. "Sir," I shouted, but nobody answered. I figured he must have gone back to his car to wait until the time of the funeral before returning, so I went to the front door to check the parking lot. I pushed the door and suddenly felt my stomach drop. The door was still locked. I had forgotten to unlock the funeral home when I arrived that morning, and it hadn't even occurred to me that I didn't hear the door chime from anybody walking in before seeing a man walk past me. There was simply no way that anyone could have been there other than me, and I most certainly didn't hallucinate what I had just seen. I wandered back into the parlor, though this time the air wasn't as thick or uncomfortable as it had been an hour or so prior. I was getting ready to walk out when something caught my attention. It was the blue suit, white shirt, and red tie that the deceased gentleman in the casket had on. I walked up to the casket and froze when I looked at that man's face. His features, his hair, and his suit were unmistakable. This was the man who had wandered down the hallway and turned to look at me as he passed. Someone called her name. I live and work in a mortuary in San Antonio, Texas. I was recently given the opportunity to become a resident of the mortuary I now work for, and being the weird kind of guy I am, I could not pass a chance such as this. I moved in on a Thursday afternoon with my girlfriend's help. I had everything moved in by the time night came. The funeral home was open that night until 10 p.m. I figured I would go ahead and stay the night in my apartment there. My girlfriend always stays with me until about 2 or 3 a.m. That particular night, my bathroom was out of order, so I was using the bathroom in the family room. My girlfriend was in the bathroom by the employee lounge on the opposite side of the building. On my way back to the apartment, I heard her scream. I ran to the other side of the building to see what the matter was, and she said she heard someone whisper her name. I told her it was okay, and we headed back to the apartment. I was spooked, as was she, so we both went to her house to stay that night. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that marks another one in the books for the Paranormal Path podcast. If you have any ideas or suggestions, don't forget, fire me an email at theparanormalpath@gmail.com. Check out our website, theparanormalpath.wixsite.com/ppam2. My apologies for such a long URL. As soon as I can afford to get my own domain, I will do it. Take care, and we'll see you again. Bye-bye.